Deal structuring is one of the more interesting aspects of modern, non-contentious corporate and banking law practice. So I find it really interesting to consider how our ancient pals structured their banks and banking deals. So in this video, I'd like to dial into the details of a classical Athenian banking deal, a lease no less of a bank, granted by the banker Pasion to his ex-slave Phormion. Our main sources are two speeches preserved amongst the speeches attributed to Demosthenes, numbers 36 and 45. Welcome to Ancient Classics. Before we get into the details, let's first get to know the key players. We met the banker Pasion in my last long-form video on offshore bank accounts. Pasion was the preeminent banker in early to mid-4th century BCE Athens. Originally a slave, he earned his freedom, and then as he rose to further prominence, eventually became an Athenian citizen. Pasion had two sons, Apollodorus and Pasicles. Apollodorus was in his mid-20s when Pasion died, and he was a spendthrift and notoriously litigious. His younger brother, Pasicles, was about 10 at the time of Pasion's death. Phormion was Pasion's former slave, a trusted employee, and a skilled banker. He doesn't seem to have been a native Greek speaker. Speech 36 was delivered by an advocate on Phormion's behalf, which is quite unusual for litigation practice at the time, and it is thought that this might have been because Phormion was not a sufficiently confident or competent speaker of Greek for him to represent himself. But moreover, in speech 45 he is called a barbarian, and for that insult to land, he presumably was not a native Greek speaker. But either way, Pasion groomed Phormion as his successor, or at least temporary steward of his business until his sons both came of age. Pasion even betrothed his wife, Archippe, to Phormion in his will, and made him a guardian for his sons, alongside another guy, Lease. But most important for our purposes is the fact that Pasion leased his banking business to Phormion, at least sometime before Pasion's death. Now, after Pasion died, Phormion ran Pasion's business under the lease and acted as joint guardian for Pasion's sons, Apollodorus and Pasicles. If we are to believe Phormion's account, Apollodorus was in the process of squandering much of his and his brother's inheritance, so Phormion and his fellow guardian formally divided up the estate so as to preserve the younger son Pasicles' share. When Pasicles did come of age, the two brothers came into their inheritance, and Phormion unwound the lease over Pasion's former banking business and returned the assets. Sometime thereafter, Apollodorus sued Phormion, claiming that he had mismanaged Pasion's estate or had unlawfully retained assets for himself. Demosthenes' speech 36, which is usually dated to around 350 BCE, is Phormion's response to Apollodorus' claim. Technically, it's a paragraphe, a form of legal action to strike out Apollodorus' claim against Phormion. Speech 36 is usually attributed to Demosthenes himself as the author, written for Phormion, but delivered by a third-party advocate. Our other source for this lease and the facts surrounding it is speech 45, which is also found in the Demosthenian corpus, although it probably was not written by Demosthenes himself. It was delivered and quite possibly written by Apollodorus, Pasion's son, and presents Apollodorus' claim against a guy called Stephanus, accusing him of lying or producing false testimony in the litigation surrounding Pasion's estate. In so doing, the speech revisits some of the relevant facts, including those relating to the business lease, which now we'll finally cover in detail. The terms of the lease are preserved in many of the manuscript copies of Demosthenes' speech 45. Now, Apollodorus in that speech claims that the lease was a forgery, and moreover it is doubted by some that the copy found in the manuscripts is authentic. So, in other words, the authenticity of this text is doubly disputed both by ancients and moderns alike. But let's read it anyway, because it generally accords with the summary and the description found in the other speech, speech 36, with one or two notable differences. It reads as follows. Lease of a bank. On the following terms, Pasion has leased the bank to Phormion. Phormion is to pay to the sons of Pasion as rental for the bank 2 talents and 40 minae each year above the daily expenditure, and it shall not be lawful for Phormion to carry on a banking business independently unless he first obtains the consent of the sons of Pasion, and Pasion owes the bank 11 talents upon the deposits. The Greek term here, universally translated as lease, is misthorsis, from misthor, meaning to lease out something or indeed to lease out your services. Now, if you've played Assassin's Creed Odyssey, then you'll remember NPCs calling the player character Misthios, a mercenary, though I think the more common ancient Greek term is Mistaphoros. But anyway, what is being leased out? According to the text of the lease agreement, it's the bank itself, the trapeza. But that brings us to the question of what a bank actually is. Now today, a bank is a business that accepts deposits and makes loans. And from our sources, including Speech 36 and many others, that seems to be what the likes of Pasion's business did too. But today, most banks are established as limited liability companies or similar entities. A company has its own legal personality, capable of owning property, entering into contracts, suing, and being sued in its own right, separate from its owners and managers. It's almost certain, however, that the basic principles of corporate or company law, limited liability and separate legal personality had not yet evolved in classical Athens. In that regard, it would have been legally impossible, at least whilst Pasion actively managed the bank, to separate the banker, Pasion, from his banking business. So the loans made by the bank to its customers were legally loans made by Pasion, and the deposits accepted by the bank constituted the personal debts or deposit return obligations of Pasion. It would nonetheless have been possible to then identify the package of contractual and pseudo-contractual rights and obligations associated with Pasion's bank business, i.e. the assets, the rights to receive repayment of loans, and liabilities, i.e. obligations to repay or return deposits, along with associated security rights and some fixtures and fittings. We might also suggest that the name or the brand of the bank, the right to hold oneself out as Pasion's bank, would form part of the banking business. So it would have been possible to identify these at some point and then transfer them across to Phormion via the lease. And indeed, because the transaction is a lease, or described as a lease, a misthorsis, not an outright sale, it would always have been the intention that the lease would eventually terminate and the business, the assets and the liabilities, would be returned, retransferred to Pasion or his successors. And we'll come on to how that might have been structured presently. It's also worth noting that Phormion was required to pay a fee or a rent throughout the term of the lease. According to Speech 36, that fee seems to have amounted to half the prosodos of the business. Now, prosodos means an approach, a way in or entry, including, incidentally, in the sexual sense too, or in a commercial setting, the income, revenues, or perhaps the profits of a business. I'm not quite sure which. This seems to be at odds, by the way, with the copy of the lease included in the manuscripts of Speech 45, which might not be authentic, insofar as according to that lease copy, the rent was a fixed amount of 2 talents and 40 minae each year, albeit adjusted. But leaving aside the basis on which the rent or fee was calculated, how was the actual transfer of the banking business both to Phormion and then back to Pasion's estate structured and effected as a matter of law? I guess feasibly it could have been structured as a sale or transfer of the banking business, i.e. the rights and obligations associated with the bank, subject to an obligation to retransfer, or indeed accompanied by a call option held by Pasion and his heirs, i.e. a right to require Phormion to sell the business back to them at some point in the future. But I might be overcomplicating things here, trying to force the so-called lease into constructs with which I'm more familiar from modern M&A practice. See, the term lease might actually be more closely and legally related to the more familiar universal concept of a real estate lease. Indeed, Edward Cohen posits that the practice of leasing banks evolved from real estate leases of the kind which we'd be definitely familiar with today. For income-producing land, like agricultural land, this kind of makes sense. A landowner leases the land out to a tenant farmer or some such. The tenant cultivates the land and pays the landowner rent. At an earlier stage of the real estate lease's development, that rent might actually have been a portion of the crops produced from the land, in which case, as Cohen puts it, by the end of the 5th century, the rent was invariably payable in cash, not in crops. Leases might therefore cover not only land, but also buildings. Elaborate lease documents were sometimes employed. Although misthousis thus developed as a mechanism for temporarily entrusting tangible assets, not for transferring a functioning business, bankers found in it a ready model for the lease of a trapeza, i.e. a bank. That sounds credible, and some evidence for the lease structure's hypothesized evolution from agricultural land leases to physical asset-heavy businesses through to banking businesses can perhaps be glimpsed at from the fact that the same lease transaction structure seems to have been used for the lease of a shield factory as well as the bank. Now, there are some other interesting legal features that one can glean from Speech 36 relating to mortgage loans, i.e. loans made by a bank and secured on real estate. Phormion's advocate is at one point explaining why the leased banking business included debts of 11 talents owed by Pasion himself to the business, or from a legal perspective, owed to Phormion himself as the business's lessee. When therefore this man, Phormion, leased the business of the bank and took over the deposits, realizing that if he had not obtained the right of citizenship with you, he would be unable to recover the monies which Pasion had lent on the security of land and lodging houses. So he chose to have Pasion himself as debtor for these sums, rather than the others to whom he had lent them. It was for this reason that Pasion was set down as owing 11 talents, as has been stated to you in the depositions. So let's unpick this. Loans were commonly secured on real estate, as they are today, and the security granted over land was registered in effect by inscribing security interests on boundary stones, the horoi, which I considered in a recent video. Only Athenian citizens were entitled to own real estate in Attica. Now, if you can't own land owing to your lack of citizenship, then you cannot enforce real estate security. Now, Pasion was an Athenian citizen, but Phormion was not. So of the two, only Pasion could enter into and enforce mortgage loans directly. They seem to have got around this problem by this back-to-back lending structure, which is alluded to in the passage from Speech 36 that I just read out. Phormion loaned money to Pasion. Pasion loaned a like amount to an end borrower landowner, taking security over the borrower's land. So Pasion's loan was secured, but Phormion's loan to Pasion was not. Phormion presumably tolerated the risk of an unsecured loan because of his relationship with Pasion, Pasion's deemed lower credit risk, and the fact that Phormion expected that losses would flow back to Pasion and his family, thereby incentivizing Pasion not to screw him over too much. Another interesting feature of the bank lease and the facts around it is the insight it gives us into the capitalization of Pasion's bank. Now, bank capital is one of my professional interests, you see, so I find this passage particularly interesting. One of the allegations made against Phormion seems to have been that when returning the banking business back to Pasion's heirs, he did not return capital originally invested in Pasion in the bank. The term for capital in this instance being alternatively kremata idia, private or personal monies, or aphorme. Later in Speech 36, Phormion's advocate explains that Pasion had not invested any capital in the leased banking business. And if we can take this speech at face value, it seems that the leased banking business and others like it were therefore primarily financed by deposits and perhaps other unsubordinated borrowings alone. Hence Phormion's advocate's assertion that banking business yields risky revenues from other people's money. The implication here is that banking business is very risky, and that Phormion's stewardship and the fact that he handed back a solvent business to Pasion's heirs is to be applauded, and that moreover Phormion has not misappropriated or unlawfully retained any capital invested by Pasion prior to granting the lease. So let's put this bank lease into its broader context. Pasion's lease to Phormion was not unique. Speech 36 alludes to several other such leases, albeit that they are all leases granted by Pasion's heirs over the same banking business. So I'm unsure whether this was a common deal structure or whether it was particular to the way Pasion and his successors did business. Fundamentally, we can see that Pasion's concern was to ensure that his banking business was managed during his semi-retirement and even after his death by someone whose banking acumen he trusted. Pasion's intention was for his banking business to ultimately be returned to his estate and his heirs, but not until his youngest son had reached maturity. Pasion presumably did not trust his son Apollodorus to run the business in the meantime, and if Phormion's accusations are to be believed, perhaps that was a wise move. Now, Phormion could simply have been appointed as some kind of trustee or guardian over Pasion's banking business and the rest of his estate, pending Pasicles, the youngest son's maturity. But then there would have arisen an incentives problem, because if Phormion were to act honestly and with integrity as a guardian or trustee alone, he would not have been able to share in the profits of the business, and seasoned banker as he was, he might not therefore have been sufficiently incentivized to run the banking business in the most commercially optimal manner, or perhaps worse still, Phormion might have been tempted to illegally and dishonestly cream off the profits for himself. But this lease structure would have resolved those tensions by granting Phormion full use, essentially, of the assets and liabilities of the banking business, subject to a retransfer obligation. Pasion had structured in an arrangement that afforded Phormion temporary control over the business and direct exposures to the risks and rewards of the business undertaking as a whole, incentivizing Phormion to run the bank as efficiently and profitably as possible, whilst ensuring that Phormion's and Pasion's estates' interests were economically aligned, especially if the rent payable by Phormion tracked the prosodos, whether that be the revenues or profits of the business, as stated in Speech 36, rather than a flat fee, as the purported copy of the lease in the manuscripts of Speech 45 states. Now, I was thinking about doing a little thought experiment and consider how I would structure this deal using modern legal tools, such as the use of corporate vehicles with varying share classes, derivatives, and limited partnership type fund structures. But to be fair, I figured not, because that would be something of an artificial exercise, because regardless of the legal tools available, the tax and regulatory issues involved in any such transaction would have been so radically different then than they are today. So rather, my view is best to just consider this transaction and the lease structure on its facts, and with reference to the legal principles that we know or can infer from the time. But with all that said, but bearing in mind that this is a hypothetical exercise and that no one is here to give tax, legal, or financial advice, how would you structure the transaction if you were a legal or tax advisor to Pasion or Phormion? How would you do it by reference to modern legal techniques, and how would you have done it by reference to what would have been available in ancient times? Either way, let us know in the comments. Meantime, like and subscribe, ring the notifications bell, and we'll be back soon.